There we go. All right. So anyway, the street photography is a genre of photography. This type of photography is usually done candidly and without your subject's permission. The essence of street photography is basically trying to capture everyday life of humanity on the streets. But the interesting part about it is that you don't necessarily have to have a person in your image for it to be considered street photography. So my name is Armando Flores, and I'm a national tech rep for Tamron, USA. Have been for a little over 6 years now. But before then, I was with another camera manufacturer. I was with Sony for 5 years. And before Sony, I was with Nikon, and I spent 22 years at Nikon. And I also studied photojournalism in college, but I never really practiced it because while I was going to college, I got hired by Nikon to be a rep. And like I said, I spent all of my career working for manufacturers. When I started with Nikon, I started doing sports photography. I did sports photography at the professional level for about 17 years. And then when I moved on with Sony, I did a little more travel, so I did a lot of travel photography. But now with Nikon, excuse me, not Nikon, now with Tamron, I cover 49 states and I cover 4 countries as well. So there's a lot of traveling. I do a lot of street photography, and I really enjoy street photography because you can practice street photography just about anywhere, and you don't necessarily need to hop on a plane to practice street photography. So today we're going to be talking about several things, and a few of the topics here are going to be camera settings. Just like any other type of photography, your camera and your lenses are tools, and it's very important to know how to use them because you want to use the right tool for the right job. We're going to be talking about lens selection as it pertains to street photography, and in my opinion, what lens you select will pretty much determine what type of street photography you're going to be practicing. Just like every other type of photography, there is composition involved, so we're going to touch on that just a little bit, and we'll talk about what's in my camera bag and what I pack on my travels or journeys and what makes sense to me. Just like everything else, there's a lot of practice involved. In fact, I'm still practicing. Every day I go out with my camera and lens, I pick up a little nugget here, and I build upon that. So I suggest you do the same. Every time you go out, try to learn something and make it into and develop into something more. Um, Camera settings. I'm gonna talk about the camera settings that I don't use. Okay, so this is one of them. The auto mode. I call it the green mode of death. The camera in this particular mode is a fully automated mode. The camera allows zero input, and it doesn't even ask you what type of photography you're doing. So first thing you want to do is you want to get out of the auto mode. The other mode that I don't use is the scene mode. Now, the scene mode is a little more biased towards a certain type of photography, but it's still a fully automated mode. It doesn't ask for your input. And once again, for example, if you select portraits sports mode, the camera does not ask you what type of portraits you are doing, or what type of sports photography that you are doing. As you can imagine, different types of sports require different settings. So it's very important to know, to utilize a mode that does allow for your input. A mode that I do use constantly is the manual mode. However, I will use the manual mode when the lighting is constant or controlled, or when I'm using a lens that has a fixed aperture. If I'm using a zoom lens, for example, and if it has a variable aperture, I do not use the manual mode. And the reason is I could get caught up in the moment, just taking pictures, seeing what my subject is doing. And if I zoom my lens out, as the lens gets longer, light is now traveling further, so there's less light hitting the lens. So your aperture on a variable aperture lens can go from, for example, if your lens is a 3.5 to 6.3, it can go anywhere between 3.5 to 6.3 as you zoom the lens out, especially when you're all the way in the telephoto setting. Uh, if that happens, and if you're in the manual mode, then that means you have to make a change to your exposure. And that's where trouble can happen, because now you're going to have to think about which of the three factors you're going to move and in which direction and why. So for example, the three factors for exposure are your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. So if you're photographing a subject in manual mode with a variable aperture lens and you zoomed it all the way out, now your exposure has changed. And if it goes if it goes all the way to 6.3, it could have changed by at least 2 stops. So now your subject is going to be 2 stops darker. Now you're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to change my shutter speed, or am I going to change my aperture? And once you decide to change one of the three factors, then you have to make a change to one of the other two or both in the opposite direction. So as you can see, for street photography, the manual mode can get a little bit complicated. So if your lighting is constant or controlled, or you have a fixed aperture lens, then manual is great. So for example, I was on a bike ride about 3 weeks ago, and it was overcast. So they call it the June gloom here in Southern California. But basically, it's a layer of marine layer coverage that just simply comes in about 3 or 4 miles inland, and that's it. It stays there for a few hours. So my exposure is constant for a few hours. So I set my exposure and I can just simply forget about it. I can concentrate on the subject in front of me and, simply take pictures. However, if my lighting is not constant or controlled, then I have to make changes. So I rather use a semi-automated mode, because now I can control whichever part of the exposure that I want. So in this case, aperture priority allows me to set my aperture because I want to control the depth of field. I want to control what part or how much of my subject is in focus. If I want to blur out the background or include everything in the scene, I can control that. The camera then controls the shutter speed, but I'm always aware of the shutter speed. I'm always aware of what that number is, because I want to make sure that if I'm hand holding the camera and lens, that my physical holding of the camera and lens is not creating any movement. So I want to make sure that the shutter speed is fast enough for that. Also, if my subject is moving, I want to make sure that my shutter speed is fast enough to freeze that movement. But in a semi-automated mode, you still have control over everything else in the camera settings. So your ISO, your focus, your meter, your white balance, everything you have control over. So in a situation like this, aperture priority allows me to simply close down my lens to gain all of the depth of field that I want, because in this particular shot, I wanted even the buildings in the background to be in focus. But like I said, the camera controls the shutter speed, but I'm always aware of that shutter speed because I want to make sure that it's fast enough to freeze any movement if that's what I want to do. So for instances, anytime you're doing some macro work, some portrait work, street photography, landscape, aperture priority is a great mode to use because it allows you to concentrate on your subject matter and spend a little more time there composing and so on. The other mode that I will use also in street photography, and I'll also use this for sports and for some nature photography as well. Anytime I want to make sure that my subject is frozen, or if it's moving very quickly, or maybe I want to show a little bit of movement or motion, I'll select shutter priority. Now I know what shutter speeds to use to freeze a subject if that's what I want to do, and I know how slow of a shutter speed to use if I want to show a little bit of movement. The camera in turn sets the aperture for me. But I'm always aware of that aperture because I also want to make sure that there's enough depth of field and my subject is in focus or my background is blurred if that's what I want to achieve. But I have control over every other aspect of the camera setting. So a semi-automated mode is great when the light is changing constantly. Your subject is moving from a dark area to a back area, or you're going from a bright background to a dark background, because it allows you to concentrate on the picture taking, efforts and not the exposure as much. So for example, in shutter priority, I'm able to go from a fast shutter speed to a very slow shutter speed and show a lot of movement or motion. This particular case, I went from a 500th of a second all the way down to a 15th of a second. The camera then, what it did is close down my lens to an f16. But anyway, that was more than enough, light for the camera to go to f16. And by going down to a 15th of a second, I was able to show a lot of movement or motion. So once again, what shutter speeds should you use? Well, that really depends on how fast your subject is moving. These are starting points for your shutter speeds. Now, most of us can physically handhold a camera and a lens at about a 60th to a 125th of a second. So if your subject is not moving, you can definitely have your shutter speed right around there. Again, these are starting points. The faster, the better. But if your subject is moving around a little bit more, maybe perhaps they're walking or just simply moving a little bit, your shutter speed needs to speed up. It needs to go from a 125th to a 250th. If your subject is running, or in this case, the image you see here, they are actually riding a bike. I have two subjects here in the image. One of them, the one on the line or closest to the lens, is traveling at 10 miles an hour. The subject slightly behind and ahead is traveling at 20 miles an hour. I selected a 1,000th of a second to freeze my subjects, but knowing that the subject that's traveling a little bit further may require a slightly faster shutter speed, maybe more like a 2,000th of a second. There is a little bit of movement there that the camera wasn't able to capture because of that speed. The subject going slower, nice and frozen. So once again, these are starting points. The faster, the better. Other camera settings that I will use for street photography and for sports or anytime I'm photographing a moving subject are as follows. Basically, continuous autofocus, continuous shooting, white balance. I do set my white balance, and sometimes I let the camera do what it wants to do. Auto ISO, that is a very interesting setting. I've been using it a little bit more lately because if you use it properly, it's actually a very good setting to use. But we'll talk a little bit about that, a little bit ahead. And we'll be talking about your metering modes because I do change my metering modes depending on my subject matter or my subject's background. So let's go ahead and jump right into continuous autofocus. Now, in continuous autofocus, the camera continues to focus. If your subject is moving, the subject's distance is changing in relation to the front of the lens. So the camera needs to continuously autofocus to keep your subject in focus, because if it doesn't focus, or if it doesn't focus fast enough, then your subject's going to be blurry, and who wants a blurry picture of of your subject, unless of course that's what you want to capture. Another camera setting that I will use is continuous shooting. So when my subjects are moving, what I want to do is I want to be able to capture as many pictures as possible so that I have several choices to select from. In this particular case, I was using a camera that allows me to shoot at 6 frames per second. And as you can see, the third frame of this sequence is the frame all the way to the right. I believe, in my opinion, that frame captured my subjects at peak action, or as soon as they reach the top and touch the bottom of that sculpture there. Now, the other 3 frames, of course, were pictures of them coming down from that jump. Now, most entry-level cameras are capable of firing anywhere from about 2.5 to 3 frames per second. Now, for street photography, 3 frames per second is probably more than fast enough to capture any movement that your subject might be doing. However, if you want to also photograph some sports, you'll find that 6 frames per second is probably at the starting point or the bottom end of where you want to be. Your mid-range cameras will fire anywhere from 5 to 7 frames per second, and your more advanced cameras, your prosumer cameras, will do anywhere from about 6 to 10 frames per second, and then your professional level cameras will do anywhere from 10 to 20 frames per second. So as you can imagine, the more frames your camera fires, the more choices you're going to have from from different shooting positions, so that you can select the subject when the image that is on in peak action. White balance, um, very interesting. I again started photography with Nikon back in 1985, and as I don't know if you know this, but the father of digital photography was Eastman Kodak. We had a very good rapport with the reps at Kodak, and when they started to develop digital cameras, they would bring us their prototypes so that we can test them and give them our 2 cents. The one interesting thing about those cameras back then, they had auto white balance. And the acronym for auto white balance is AWB, but we changed that acronym very, very quickly from the first few tests of their cameras, from auto white balance to always wrong balance. Because believe me, back then the cameras did not get the white balance right. But cameras from about 5, 6 years ago do a very good job. I find myself using auto white balance probably 75 to 80% of the time nowadays. Once again, they do a very good job, but sometimes they can be fooled. Now, I do shoot in RAW, so I always have the advantage of changing my white balance after the fact if necessary. So let's take this example. I did select auto white balance, and now this was a night scene, and the color temperature of the lights were basically the camera captured the image and added way too much yellow to compensate for what it thought the color temperatures of the lights were. So I had to, in Photoshop, take my white balance and slide it over to the left. I had to take out some of the yellow and add some of that blue back to correct the white balance. But once again, like I said, I shoot in RAW, so that's very simple to do. Now, if you shoot in JPEG is a processed file, so it already has all the adjustments done to it. Sometimes it could be a little bit difficult to change your white balance or to adjust it or correct it. If that's the case, then you can always desaturate your image if you can't correct for the white balance, and turn it into a black and white, so it's not a total loss. Nowadays, a lot of the programs do allow a lot more flexibility with the JPEG files than they used to. But it is very important to get it as close as possible in the camera, so that you don't have to, so you don't run into these issues. There are a couple settings that you can do in white balance. You can select a custom white balance. For example, a custom white balance allows you to tell the camera to read the light for that particular scene and make its adjustments. Now, it'll keep that white balance until you decide to change it. Each camera brand does custom white balance just a little bit different, so it's very important to look at your instruction book and figure out how to do a custom white balance. The other way you can do white balance is you can simply select the Kelvin temperature setting and then select the Kelvin temperature. Most cameras also allow you to vary the tint just a little bit. In other words, they will allow you to add a little magenta or a little more blue or yellow, depending on the color cast that that particular lighting is situation is giving you. Like for example, fluorescent lights adds a little greenish cast. So what you want to do is add a little magenta. But once again, those are settings that you can do once you're really comfortable with them. Now, auto ISO, like I said, is very interesting because it allows the camera a little more control, but you can still set the parameters. So for example, if I'm photographing a subject that is transitioning from very bright to a very dark background, or from a very well lit area to a very dark area, and back and forth rapidly, manual exposure would be a nightmare because you would have to make your exposure changes really quickly, and doesn't really allow you a lot of time to concentrate on the subject matter. So what happens, let's say for example, I'm shooting in shutter priority. So I've selected my shutter speed. The camera then selects the aperture for me. And if I have auto ISO turned on, then now the camera also can make changes to the ISO. So I don't know if you found yourself in a position where you've selected a semi-automated mode. In this case, let's go to shutter priority, for example. I'm photographing the subject. Let's say I'm photographing this particular subject at about a 2/50th of a second, because that's fast enough to freeze any movement that he might create. But then all of a sudden he moves a lot quicker, and I decide I want to change the shutter speed to a much higher level, let's say a 2,000th of a second. Okay, so that's a three-stop change. So you go from 250, that's 500, that's 1,000, that's 2,000. That's a three exposure change, three shutter speed change. So what the camera then does is it changes the aperture. Well, let's say you have a lens mounted on the camera that the maximum aperture only goes up to, let's say, 5.6. Okay, so you're at the telephoto setting. At 2/50th of a second, the camera was already at 5.6, so it can't open up the lens any longer. But you've gone ahead and you change your shutter speed 3 stops. Your exposure is going to be 3 stops too dark because the aperture sign starts blinking. The camera's warning you. It's gone beyond the parameters. It can't open up the lens anymore. However, in auto ISO, you've now given the camera the ability to now change the ISO to give you the correct exposure. However, there are parameters that you must set so that the camera doesn't go from the native ISO, which could be 100 ISO, and then all the way to as high as the camera is capable of going. Some cameras are capable of going beyond 100,000 ISO. Not that the images are necessarily going to look good, but it's capable of doing that. So now when you change the ISO on a camera, what you're actually doing is you're turning up the gain on that sensor. You're telling the sensor, okay, make this picture brighter by simply, by tweaking the sensor to allow more light to come in to make the picture brighter. That's really what you're doing. As an example, if you've ever taken a road trip and then your favorite radio station starts fading out and you start hearing a lot of background noise, a lot of hissing. What happens when you turn up the volume? That noise gets much louder. Same thing with the ISO. So what you want to do, and this is one thing that I do when I get a brand new camera, I do an ISO test. So I will go out and take pictures, and I will usually start at about 800. Most cameras do great up to 800, and then they start diminishing or getting noisy at higher ISOs. So then I'll double the ISO, 1600, 32, 64, and so on and so forth. And I'll go as high as the camera will allow me to go. And then what I'll do is I'll make prints. And I'll pick out that print that in my opinion, I think that print is way too noisy. And now I know what my tolerance for noise is with that particular camera body. So when I did my ISO test on my camera, I looked at the images and I said, okay, I will never go above 3200 ISO. So now I've got the parameters for auto ISO. I can tell the camera never go above this ISO number. And another setting that you can select is your shutter speed. You can tell the camera never drop below the shutter speed as well. So now it becomes a very powerful tool when you're using a semi-automated mode. So play with auto ISO, set the parameters, and see what you think. Because if you ever get caught in a situation where your camera's aperture taps out in shutter priority, your camera can then control your ISO. Let's talk a little bit about the metering modes. Now, most cameras have 3 different meters. Some Canon cameras, have 4 metering modes. One of those is a combination of 2, and I think their latest cameras reverted back to 3 meters. So the meters, the way they actually work, let's take matrix metering or the evaluative metering. What's happening is that the camera is reading 100% of what's in the frame. And it's averaging everything out. Now, some cameras are smart enough to know where you focused, and what they'll do is they'll bias the metering just a little bit more on where you focus, but they still average everything out. So when your background is pretty even, when your subject is pretty evenly illuminated and the background or foreground isn't too bright or too dark, it's just the right mix, matrix metering does, or evaluative metering does a great job. There are some cases, however, where the background may be too dark or too bright. Matrix metering can be fooled in that case, or the evaluative metering can be fooled. Then in that case, you may want to revert to a center weighted meter. Now, the way a center weighted meter works is that it reads either 65, 70, 75, or 85% of the metering in the very center of that frame. And then the balance of that weighted is done down to the edges and down to the corners. It varies from one camera model to the next and from one camera brand to the next. So it's important, once again, to know what your center weighting is and what is the size of that circle as well, because that can vary from one camera model to the other as well. Some cameras are smart enough to allow you to change the amount of the weighting and the size of the circle as well. So take a look at your instruction book once again and see how your camera is handling the metering in center weighted meter. Now, the other metering mode down there at the bottom is spot meter, and that's basically one small circle is metering 100% in one particular spot. Some cameras are smart enough to allow you to move that spot anywhere you want in the frame. In fact, it will follow your autofocus point. So wherever you move your autofocus point, that could be 100% of your metering in spot meter. Once again, each camera model and manufacturer does this a little bit differently, so it's important to know how your camera handles spot meter. So in a case like this, where my subject my scene is pretty evenly lit. Yes, my subject is sitting underneath an overhang, so it's a little bit darker, but that's where I focus. So the camera takes that into consideration, and then it averages everything out. So in a case like this, matrix or an evaluative meter does a pretty good job. There are some cases, however, where your subject, the foreground or the background could be too bright or too dark. Center weighted can be fooled. So in a case like this, I saw the sky and I said, thought to myself, okay, there's a lot of light coming in through there. The camera is going to then take my subject, which is right in the center of the frame, and probably underexpose it. So center weighted, in my opinion, did a better job than matrix would have done. There is a button or a dial on your camera, depending on, once again, what model you have, and that is called the exposure compensation mode. Now, if you're in matrix or any other metering mode, you can tell the camera to vary the exposure by simply changing the amount in the exposure compensation mode. So if I knew in a case like this that the bright sky was going to cause my subject to go underexposed. I could have taken the exposure compensation and tell it to overexpose by maybe two-thirds of a stop or maybe one full stop. So then the camera in matrix mirroring does is averaging, and then it varies or it defers to the exposure compensation, and then it adds or corrects from that amount. So in a case like this, where the subject matter here is the sun, I took spot meter and I metered on the sun because I knew that it was going to give me an exposure where my foreground or the statues were going to become silhouettes. So my lens was set to f16. I was in aperture priority, set it to f16. The camera then set the shutter speed to around about a 2,000th of a second, I believe. And at f16, if you take a light source like the sun or a street light or whatever, and then you obscure it with an object, in this case the hands, it actually makes it into a starburst. So I made a sunburst here um, with the sun being obscured from the statue's hands there. Very simple to do. You can actually see it happening in the camera. So if you want to play with that, that's the way to do it. F16 and, kind of play peekaboo with the sun against an object. But in this case, Spot Meter did a good job. Now, I look at Spot Meter and use Spot Meter when I'm in a situation where I may be doing a stage production. So there's a stage and then the lights get turned down and then they put a spotlight on your subject. So spotlight, Spot Meter. That's the way I think about it. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about lenses. We are a lens manufacturer, and that's what we do. And in my opinion, the lens that you select will pretty much determine what type of street photography you're going to be doing. So if you have a personality where you're an extrovert and you like to talk to people, you like to be right in the mix of things, prime lenses are great for you because they are a fixed focal length and they usually have a very large aperture. So they are great for, in low light situations as well. But they don't zoom, so you physically have to move in and move out of the scene or get close or further away from your subject. And if you select a focal length that is pretty ideal for street photography, and I'll mention what those are in a second, then you'll be right in the mix. Now, if you want a little more flexibility, but still want this general, focal length, there are standard zoom lenses that you can use. A standard zoom lens, once again, is right within that mix of focal lengths that you want for street photography, but they allow you a little flexibility. You can be standing there, you go to the wide end, you can capture a little wider scene, or you can zoom in and then get your subject and isolate it. So once again, standard zoom lenses, very flexible for the type of street photography where you want to be right in the middle of everything. In this particular case, my subjects are pretty close. I don't want to get wet, so I'm standing a little bit back, but the lenses allow me that flexibility. Now, lenses that I consider pretty ideal for street photography would be a 35 millimeter. These are the prime lenses, a 45 millimeter, maybe even a 50 millimeter, an 85 millimeter, or at the very longer end, a 90 millimeter. Standard zoom lenses that you may want to look at for street photography would be a 24-70, a 28-75, or a 35-150. These are pretty good lenses, once again, for that style of street photography. Now, if your style of street photography is getting a lot more of the scene in, then you're going to want either a wide angle zoom lens or a wide angle prime lens. This particular case, there's a lot going on. My scene is a very large group of people. The sculpture is very large, and I want the buildings in the background to also be part of the image. So in this case, a 15-30 allows me to stay close to the subject and stay pretty close to the scene and to the action, but allow me to capture a lot more of what's happening. When you're in the mix, when you are in a large crowd, but you want to capture a lot more of what's going on, also pretty ideal for that type of shooting style. Or when you want to capture a lighter, a greater scene, and still allow for close proximity to a subject. Prime lenses are ideal for that as well. The lenses that I would say are pretty good or ideal for this style of street photography would be either a 20mm lens, a 24mm lens, and a 28mm lens. These are ideal for that style of street photography. Those would be your prime lenses. If you want a wide angle zoom for this style of photography, then you may want to look at a 15 to 30, a 17 to 35, a 17 to 28, or if you are if you have a crop sensor camera, maybe a 10 to 24. Now remember, anytime you mount a lens on a crop sensor camera, you have to multiply that focal length by the crop factor, because a crop sensor camera is viewing a cropped in section of that full frame image. Everything in digital photography or in photography is always being referred to to the standard. The standard was for many, many years 35mm film. So a crop sensor camera has a sensor that is smaller than a piece of 35mm film. So therefore, there is a crop factor. There's a magnification that's happening. You're viewing a cropped in section of it. Most cameras, most digital SLR cameras have an APS-C size sensor. If you shoot a Nikon, a Sony, a Fuji, some Pentax and Leicas, they have an APS-C size sensor with a crop factor of 1.5. So you take that focal length and multiply by 1.5. If you have an APS-C size sensor Canon, that sensor is just a little bit smaller. The crop factor is 1.6. So guess what? That 10 to 24, it's actually on a 1.5 crop factor, it's actually a 15 to 36. So there you go. That's the way it works. Even if that lens is designed for a crop sensor camera, you still do the crop factor. The way I like to shoot, however, is I like to be a little bit further away from the action. I like to capture more candid images. I don't like the subject to be influenced by my presence or by me holding a camera in front of them. So I like to shoot guerrilla street photography style, as they call it. I'm hiding, not lurking, but basically from a distance, pick up the camera, frame my picture, take it, and then put the camera down so that their body language does not change. With a telephoto lens, you're able to do this type of street photography. This particular case, I'm using a 70 to 180 all the way to 180 millimeters. Which gives you a little bit of breathing room, and you maintain a nice safe distance from the scene or the events that are going on. The telephoto zoom lenses are also ideal for when you want to isolate your subject from the background. So in this particular case, a 70 to 180 at 180 millimeters at 2.8, because of the large aperture, also allow me to blur out the background a little bit more. This allows me to isolate my subject from the background. So for me, this is the type of lens that I like to use. This is ideal for the type of street photography that I do. There are other types of lenses that I recommend also for street photography, but I also recommend these lenses a little more for people who are just starting out in photography. Maybe perhaps you're really not sure of what type of photography you're going to get into. An all-in-one lens allows you to dabble in all types of photography. And, it's pretty ideal for those people who have a kit style camera system. Maybe you've gone out and bought a camera. They came with two lenses, and only one lens will replace both of those lenses, usually with a better quality lens to begin with. This particular case, I'm walking down the street. This is in Savannah, and I see the flag fluttering in the wind. And then I started to think, okay, if I go behind it, will the flag be backlit? And then maybe perhaps I can capture some interesting shots. So yes, I crossed the street when I went to the other side. And yes, it was nicely backlit. I selected a slow shutter speed to capture some of that movement because I wanted only a little bit of the flag to be nice and sharp and the rest to be blurry. So this particular case, all-in-one lens was pretty ideal because it allowed me to go a little bit further back than perhaps a regular standard telephoto lens would. Now, I was in this particular situation, I was in Venice Beach. I was at the skate park, and there were a lot of skaters. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to capture a portrait of sorts with with this lens. So I, zoomed the lens out to about a 300 millimeter as the skaters were going across the deck there. So I followed the subject as moved the camera and moved with the subject as they were skating across there at a fast shutter speed. I was able to, freeze the movement. So, pretty ideal. 18 of 400. That is a lot of range. So if you're not sure what type of photography you want to get into, this lens will allow you to go from, wide angle landscapes all the way to, wildlife and nature type of situation, or even some outdoor sports. This particular case, I was out on assignment. This was mid-November a couple years back, and they actually sent me to Minnesota. I'm from Southern California. The weather that day was minus 27 degrees. It was the coldest I've ever been. But, being a photographer, what do? You take pictures. So what I did is I grabbed the camera and the lens, and I simply opened up the shade from my hotel and waited there until hoping that somebody would walk down the street. Now it's minus 27 degrees. It's about 9 o'clock in the evening. Chances of that happening, I thought, were nil. But, 35 to 40 minutes later, somebody did walk down the street. I waited for the subject to get right into this little clearing right before they got to the tree and fired off 2 or 3 frames. And that was basically it. But, once again, you're able to do street photography just about anywhere. Now, not all street photography has to be something that just happens in front of you. It could be a setup shot. In this particular case, I had an idea for many years that I wanted to capture. I wanted to capture a surfer at sunset right by a guard tower. I rode down, to Venice Beach on the bike, and I saw that they were doing some repairs down the beach, and they had moved 3 guard towers really close to each other, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to do that shot. Because normally the guard towers are about 100 yards apart from each other. You never really get this. And I don't know if you know this, but the human brain loves odd numbers, 1s, 3s, and 5s. So I thought 3 guard towers next to each other, I'll never get this again. So I, waited until it got, close to sunset. And then I noticed that the surfers were leaving the beach already. So I then had to improvise. So I ran down to the surf shop, rented a surfboard, and waited for somebody to walk down the sand and, hopefully, help me out with this shot. So surely enough, about, 10 minutes later, there was a family walking up the sand. And I approached them and asked if one of them would volunteer and, hold the surfboard right over there for me. And they did. So, and I agreed to send them a shot after, I was done with it. So anyway, once again, not all street photography has to be something that happens. It can be something that you set up. Now, we view the world, we've got two eyes, we view the world horizontally, and it's very important to tell yourself that to flip the camera every once in a while. So what I do is I've got a little voice inside my head. I shoot 3 or 4 frames horizontal, and then I go vertical, vertical. So I flip the camera and then take a vertical shot, because you just never know. A vertical might be a better shot than the horizontal. You just never know. In this particular case, I happen to like the vertical better than the horizontal, but again, that's just me. So, practice that, get out there, take some pictures, and then tell yourself, to flip that camera vertical, every once in a while. Also, tell yourself to come back at different times of the day. If you find some object or, a particular background that you find interesting, take your pictures and then plan to come back at, a different time of day. Maybe you were there high noon, maybe come back at sunset or once it gets dark, because you just never know what's going to happen. This particular case, I was there for the first time. I had no idea that they actually put on colored lights on the structure at night. So it was a happy accident. So I walked down there with my camera right before dinner, and there you go. Captured the same image, just with a little different lighting. So the way I like to shoot street photography is I like to find an interesting subject, either background or foreground, or some element that I know is going to attract my subject. This particular case, Chicago, Millennium Park, they have these water fountains that, spit out water every once in a while. So I parked myself and just waited for my subjects to react to, what was happening. I would park myself maybe, sometimes for over an hour. Again, just depending on what's going on and how interesting things are happening. And yes, I do tell myself to take some horizontals. In this particular case, I went horizontal to vertical, right? Because I thought that the vertical would isolate my subjects just a little bit more and maybe perhaps make it a little more interesting, interesting shot. Slow down the shutter speed just a little bit to allow enough of that water movement to show, and it shows just like a, just like a stream. It's not really frozen. So once again, work the shutter speed, work the aperture, isolate your subject, add a little bit more depth of field, speed up your shutter speed, drop the shutter speed, just play with it and see which way, it looks better. And yes, if you like the subject matter enough, come back at a different time of day. This particular case, I saw that the fountains were backlit, and there were some images projected from inside. So I figured, okay, I'm going to come back at night and simply expose for the wall, for the images. And I knew in that case that my subjects who would stand in front of it would just be silhouettes. And basically that's what I wanted to achieve. So there you go. Now let's talk a little bit about composition. So, you've been probably bombarded with the rule of thirds, but I do use the rule of thirds all the time I photograph. I actually turn on the grid inside my viewfinder. It's a it's a rule of thirds grid, so it gives you the frame in 3 different sections, horizontally and vertically, and the lines where they intersect are the PowerPoints. I basically turn the grid on because I can't really take a straight picture to save my life. I don't know why. My horizons always come just a little bit tweaked, but that line down at the bottom, if that's where I put my horizon, allows me to straighten it out quite easily. This particular shot, I wanted the subject to be a very small part of the entire scene because there was a lot more happening there. Water, the waves were coming in, crashing onto the brakes there and creating big splash. So put my subject down at the bottom portion of the frame in near one of the intersecting power points there. It doesn't have to be right smack on it, just somewhere close. And in my opinion, this made for a more interesting shot. Leading lines. Leading lines are also very important in any picture situation, because if you can find them, what you can do is you can use a leading line to lead your viewer's eye right to the subject. In this case, you've got that corner where the fountain, actually both sides of the wall actually meet. That's a very nice straight sharp line. I'm using that as a leading line. And also I slowed down my shutter speed to give that water enough time so you can get that movement and that white showing. This allows all of that water splashing down at the bottom to create a leading line down to my subject as well. So now I'm using a slow shutter speed plus the very sharp edge as leading lines. Also, remember, in any situation where you have a subject that is moving in a certain direction or even looking in a certain direction, it's important to give it a little bit of breathing room. In this particular case, I've got my subjects on riding, bicycles or skating or running on the bike path, and they're moving from right to left. So I'm concentrating on that. The way I shoot is that I usually select my single autofocus point somewhere near where I'm going to frame my subject. This particular case, my subjects were traveling right to left. I give it a little bit of breathing room. So I select the focusing point that is closer to the right. So I am already focused, continuous autofocus, continuous shooting, and I'm framed so that I give my subject just a little bit of breathing room in front. So it works for me, and this forces my composition also at the same time as I'm taking pictures. So once again, there's more time for me to concentrate on what's happening and less time thinking about all of those rules, your leading lines, your rule of thirds, all that stuff that can be distracting if you just sit there and start thinking about it. Now, when I photograph in this way, I am left eye dominant, so I focus with, put the camera up to my eye, focus with the left, but I also keep my right eye open. And the reason I do that is because that allows me to see the subject as is approaching and as it's coming into the frame. Also for sports photography, very important if you're actually out in the field or near the field and you have subjects maybe coming in from one side or the other. This allows me to basically anticipate and get ready for the shot as they approach my frame. And because I shoot like that, it allows me to see things out in a distance. This particular case, I was out taking pictures. I was using a 70 to 180. I was already fully extended at 180 millimeters. And I saw the subject coming from the right and moving into my frame. I quickly picked up the camera, pointed it at my subject, but I only had one opportunity to take the picture. I only got one frame off. Because then everything happened right in front and then it obscured the image, and there you go. So my composition and my cropping weren't exactly the way I would have done it. So what I did is I took the picture and then I, realized that I'm going to have to crop it after the fact. And in this particular case, I had to do a lot of cropping. In fact, this is about 50% of that original picture. So I shot this with a 24 megapixel camera and I threw away 50% of my data. So now I'm down to 12 megapixels. Is that a bad thing? Well, no, not really. But it really depends on what you're going to do with your image later on. The way I shoot is I like to future-proof my images. In other words, I'd like to have as much resolution because I may not know what I want to do with the image a year down the road. This particular case, like I said, I'm stuck with 12 megapixels, but if all I'm going to do is do a presentation on a high-def screen like this is a 1920, so 1920 pixels horizontally, and then 1080 pixels vertically. You multiply those two numbers, you get 2.2 million. So all I really need is about 2 million pixels to show an image on a high-def screen. However, as you know, technology advances and things just simply get better. So about 5 years ago, they came out with 4K screens. 4K screens has 4 times the resolution of a high-def screen, and now you need 8 million pixels to show an image on one of those screens. And yes, 2 years ago, they came out with 8K screens. So now you need 4 times the resolution of 8K. So guess what? Now you're going to need about 32 million pixels to be able to show an image on that type of screen. So that's the reason that I like to get my images as close as possible in the viewfinder, so I don't have to do a lot of cropping and I don't have to do a lot of manipulating. I don't like to spend a lot of time behind the computer, so I like to get it as close as possible when I press the button. Okay, so when I'm out taking pictures, I'm always looking at tone and texture. This particular case, I saw that, that stainless steel background, and I saw a lot of shades of gray. So I framed my shot. I mean, there's almost no cropping to this image. Frame my shot. You've got the human element, the baby stroller down at the bottom right. That would be a PowerPoint. But once again, I'm looking at the scene. I shoot it in color, but I'm thinking of black and white because I'm going to desaturate it later on. I always shoot in color because it is easier to desaturate your image than trying to put the color back into a black and white image. That's just not going to happen. Again, I shoot in RAW, and it makes things pretty easy to go from one to the other. Now, once again, what I like to do is find something interesting and just simply wait for that human element to approach. This particular case, I'm photographing, I'm standing at the edge of the sidewalk and just waiting for somebody to walk by. But most people, what they do is they see me with the camera up to my eye and they stop right outside the frame. So what I simply do is I wave them through with one hand. No, go ahead. It's okay. So they just walk by, and I just, wait for somebody interesting to walk by and, press the button in that case. The way I also approach a scene is I look for something interesting and then try to work it and make that image better. So find something interesting, take a picture, and then tell yourself, how can I improve this? Well, in this case, you get closer. You move in, and there's your subject. The background is also part of the scene, but I wanted them obscure. I didn't want to be able to see their face entirely. So keep working the scene. Get rid of some distraction. In this case, there's way too much happening. So reframe, recrop, move in closer. Slightly different, lower angle. Wait for your subject to do something interesting, and then take the picture. So I like to call that working the image. So what's in my camera bag? Now, that really depends on what type of photography I'm going to be doing. I'm usually at an event or at an assignment for Tamron. So I travel with a backpack. This backpack allows me to carry three cameras. So I'll carry a DSLR, I'll carry a crop sensor camera, and I'll also carry a mirrorless camera. I'll take somewhere from 4 to 7 different lenses as well for the cameras. I do take a spare battery for each one of the camera bodies. And I also take multiple straps. I have a strap system that allows me to go from a wrist strap, so I can have the camera secured to my wrist, but I still have the camera, gripped. So if I'm walking around, if I'm working the scene, a wrist strap is ideal because I am constantly looking, putting the camera up to my eye, composing, shooting, and then repeating that movement once again. But if I'm going to be walking around, downtown or some part of a city, and I'm going to be doing a lot of walking, I'd rather carry a strap that allows me to carry the camera messenger style down to my hip, where I can easily grab it with my right hand, bring it up to my eye, and then just simply place it down. The camera strap system that I use allows me to unclip one kind of strap and then simply clip on the other one. So it's very easy to do. Every time I travel, I will also carry an extra bag. I throw in an extra bag in my suitcase so that once I get to that particular place where I'm going to be, I can then take the camera and the lens or camera and lenses that I'm going to need. But when I walk around a new city or town, I take one camera and one lens. I don't want to be a target. I don't want to be a tourist per se. So what I'll do is I usually revert to the mirrorless cameras because they are smaller, they're more compact, and it doesn't say photographer here. That's usually the way I like to approach things. What I also like to do is I like to give myself assignments every once in a while. Most of the images that you just saw in this presentation were from an assignment that I gave myself. I was actually doing an event in Chicago, and I decided, okay, I'm going to photograph two cities in the same day with one camera and one lens. So I chose the 45 millimeter lens because I had not really put it through its paces. And I had an afternoon flight from Chicago to Los Angeles. I was coming back home. So woke up early, got out of the hotel, grabbed the camera, the lens, walked around Millennium Park, for the first part of the two cities in one day, and then caught the plane, flew to LA, caught an Uber home, grabbed my bike, same camera and lens in a backpack, rode down to the beach, and then I continued that assignment. This particular case, I was simply tired of being quarantined. I said it's time for me to go out, get some fresh air, get some exercise, and see what I can shoot. So I grabbed one camera, two lenses, put in a backpack, grabbed the bike, and just rode up to Santa Monica and ran into a peaceful protest. Well, rode into a peaceful protest. So I'm walking around. I've got my cleats. I've got my cycling gear on, right? And the cleats are, your shoes have this metal claw in the bottom that grabs the pedal. So I'm walking around, like a duck, got the bicycle in one hand and then the camera with the hand strap in the other. And I'm, just walking around there taking pictures. And, here you go. Police in the riot gear, helicopter hovering over. And then once things got a little bit crazy, I switched lenses. I went to the telephoto lens. I pulled back a little bit to the side by the sidewalk, still shooting though. And then I decided to come back, 2 days later and to see what's going on. So downtown closed, National Garden place, businesses boarding up. And just as quickly as it happened, a couple of days later, everything was back to normalish. So there you go. Give yourself an assignment. Go out and, force yourself to take pictures, maybe one camera, one lens, or a particular subject matter or a particular place, anything that forces you to go out and shoot. And remember, have fun and always take a selfie. We are on social media, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Do we have any questions?
All right. Thanks, Armando, for that great presentation.
Thank you.
For everybody that's still here with us, if you do have any questions that you want us to address right now, go ahead and drop that in the chat, and I'll be bringing those up one by one. The first one that was laid out in there was from Judith Robb, and this is the number one question for street photography, both on the photographer side and subject side. But what is the legality of walking around and photographing people when you're talking about street photography? Armando, I'm trying to figure out what's happened, but I think we have lost your audio somehow.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Are we? Am I? Are we there?
Yes, now you're
Okay.
back. So
Okay.
I think you actually cut out right as you started to answer that
Oh,
question.
okay.
So
So
you were going
yes.
on a good roll, but I think you're going to have to start over.
Okay. So yeah, this probably got loose over here. Okay. So yeah, legally in the United States, if you are in a public place, you are free game. In other words, people can take a picture of you and they do have the right. However, I wouldn't, if somebody approaches you and confronts you because you took their picture, keep that in mind. But legally, you are allowed to. Now, if you are going to monetize those images, however, if you are going to use this for a publication or an advertisement or something that's going to make you money, then you do have to get their permission. You have to get a model release.
I think that's great information right there, and that's the distinctive part that a lot of people seem to forget and kind of gets blurred between the photographer's rights and the public's rights.
Yep.
Once you put yourself in a public place, that is kind of an assumption of a loss to the right of privacy, and it's not
Yes.
against the law for somebody to take your picture. But as Armando did say, if you go out and practice street photography and you capture some really great images, you are not allowed to profit off of that image if there's an identifiable person in it
Correct.
without a model release. And then that even goes beyond people into a lot of other different subjects as well.
Yeah.
There are limitations of being able to sell a print of a specific building because there are actually, the architects and people involved with the design of that building own copyrights to that.
Yep.
But if you take a picture of a skyline of a city, that's an entirely different situation. So
Right. Yeah. If you want the full legalities, there's a lot of information on the internet. ASMP, PPA, all of those have the laws of capturing images and how you can use them, and you can also find model releases on their websites that you can download as well.
uh, Ron Wilson asked a great question of how do you get a model release when you are shooting a crowd as opposed to just an individual? Or do the same rules apply there?
Right. Yeah, that's going to be tough. And if, like you say, if you can see their likeness in that image and you're going to monetize it, you have to. So you just have to carry a lot of model releases in your camera bag and, hunt that person down and, have them sign it if you want to profit from it.
Right. And it all depends on, what your usage goal of those images
Yeah,
are. Are you trying to profit off of that? Are you a photojournalist that's documenting for a local news company? Because that's a completely different situation.
that's correct.
Um,
Yes.
and then, like Armando has said, it all depends on the likeness of a person as well. If you shoot the back of a crowd, it's not very likely that there's going to be identifiable features in that image for you to have to worry about it. But if you shoot from the front of the crowd, it's a much different picture. So all kind of different things that go into that. Ron also asked, are Tamron lenses affordable? And I'll take on that one. I won't even make you answer it. But yeah, compared to the counterparts of the manufacturer lenses that are available, typically from a Tamron lens. So you have just one situation, Tamron's 24 to 70 2.8 with their vibration compensation system in it is currently on sale for I think $10.99 until the end of this week, so $1,100. You get the same options in Canon or in Nikon or in Sony even. I think Canon's is, even when it's on sale, is $1,600 and does not have image stabilization. Nikon has a 24-70 with VR, which is their stabilization mode, and when it's on sale, it is right around $2,000, $2,100. And then Sony has their 24-70 2.8 G Master that is, I think, about $2,300. Quoting all these from the top of my head, so they're pretty close in price there. But you can see that the Tamron, which is still great quality, is hundreds up to $1,000 less than what your other options might be with the lens directly from your manufacturer. So, Armando, if you'd like to add anything of maybe how Tamron is able to develop and sell lenses that can be, sold for significantly less than what the manufacturer counterparts are, I think that would be a great add right there.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that Tamron does is that we have factories that manufacture all the components, so we don't have to outsource any of the components. We make everything we need, to manufacture a lens. We don't do a lot of advertising, so you don't have to pay Ashton Kutcher, for example, millions of dollars to advertise your cameras. And all we do is lenses. We don't do cameras, flashes, and everything else. So we're able to pass on those savings to our consumers.
All right, I think that's a great wrap up. If anybody has another question, go ahead and get it in here right quick, or we'll be wrapping up in just a few more moments. As you can still see on the screen, Armando has left up his social media contacts, so you can find them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all at the AF Tamron Tech. One of the easiest ways to reach us consistently right now is through email and also through our social media channels as well. So if you're trying to reach anybody at the store through email, info@Calagaz is a great one to be able to get everything addressed quickly. Also, we are on Facebook. It is facebook.com/Calagaz. And then on Instagram, it's @CalagazPhoto. And I don't see any other questions coming in. So Armando, I just want to say thank you again for being here with us today and for this great presentation. Thanks to Tamron Lenses for being able to partner with us during this time period when having an in-person class is not necessarily the smartest idea. It's been great to be able to offer these every couple of weeks and still continue with the education and the learning in photography while we're distanced away from each other in person. So there's a lot of comments coming in just saying thanks for the presentation, Armando, and I want to say thank you to everybody that's still here with us as well for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
All right, with that one, everybody that is still here, be on the lookout for the next announcements. We are working with Tamron to create some new dates. We might also have some other presentations coming from our other manufacturers here in the next few weeks as well. So just check into our social media channels. If you're not on our email newsletter, go to calagaz.com, and there's a link to sign up for that right at the top of the page, so you'll be the first to get that sign-up information. And if you came in late to the presentation or you would just like to rewatch it, be looking out in your email, because tomorrow afternoon you'll be getting a link to view this privately on our YouTube page, and you can rewatch any portion that you've missed or anything that you want to go back and take some more notes on and revisit. So thank you, Armando, for being here, and thank you, everybody, for being here with us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Aaron.